For nearly 20 years through resistance, Krista and Mohamed talk revolution through the spiritual lens of their Egyptian and indigenous perspectives. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anti-Case Taro. I am here today with Mohamed Abdu, and the two of us are going to talk about several different topics that we're both interested in and have talked about over the years. As the intro for this said, this is going to be two friends of nearly 20 years in struggle having talks on politics. Mohamed has been on here before to be interviewed about his book, Islam and Anarchism. And we are just doing this as questions we created. And Mohamed.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and glad tidings be upon you, Ya Krista, our loved ones, and whoever inshallah might be listening at present and in the near future. As you know, I usually start anything that I say with Moses' prayer in the Quran when he was about to meet Pharaoh, accompanied by his brother Aaron. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم اشرح لي صدري, O Creator, open thy breast, ويسر لي أمري, and make my and our affairs easy. And undo the knot on my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with you, what we have to share amongst one another, reaches folks' hearts, minds, and spirits.
You've said before that Hamas isn't fighting for a state. Tell us more about this.
Thank you. Our Mujahideen are fighting for what I refer to as the Quran of the resistance, the Quran of the oppressed, for an Islam of the below. Hamas went through several incarnations, as I described before. And the general moved the arc of Al-Qassam and with it Hamas in Gaza towards the below. And this becomes a crucial distinction given the question that is to follow as well, that I know you have set up. And in so doing, they are fighting for an ummah. What is an ummah? The ummah is an anti-statist concept. It is an anti-capitalist concept, or a non-capitalist and a non-statist. It is an ummah for all believers. As I had noted earlier, in Islam, sovereignty belongs to Creator, and the embodiment of that sovereignty manifests in a concept called the ummah on earth. This ummah includes spirit world, non-human life, animal life, plants that are nations, tribes, cosmos onto their own. And it is an ummah of believers because the concept of Muslim only appears 5 or 6 times in the Quran. The emphasis is on the concept of believer. And what is a believer? One traces those characteristics. The believer is the one that minds the rights of the orphans, the poor, the elderly, women, children, that does not engage in riba, which is interest, that does not engage in israf, which is waste, tabzir. And that is what our Mujahideen are fighting for. They're not fighting for a Palestinian state. This is why even Abu Ubaidah and the general, whenever they speak, and even Commander Adif, may Allah accept their martyrdom, when they speak, they say, Ya Ummat al-Mu'mineen, Ya Ummat Muhammad, or the Ummah of Muhammad, or Ummah of believers. Where are you? In retrospect to us, because these are your sacred sites that we protect, that we uphold. And this is what is crucial, because of the politics of translation and mistranslation that a lot of Muslims and Arabs in particular, because Arabs and a lot of Muslims may read the Quran, but that does not mean that they fathom and understand it. Muslims do not have, and Arabs do not have a concept of a state. That's a product of Euro-colonial modernity. Of course, during the colonial era, we started to use a word that means the opposite of state, and that word is from the Quran, and we started to use it as state. The word is called duwayla, but duwayla falls between 2 verbs, dar, to rotate, and zab, to go away, to disappear. And so, because we didn't have a word for state, we started to apply this word in the context of a state. Sadly, a lot of Muslim Marxists do not consider the question of political power that way. They may be anti-capitalist, they may engage in non-capitalist, but they're constantly hear them referring to, well, the Prophet founded the state. The Prophet didn't found the state, he founded an ummah. And that ummah first had moved from Mecca to Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, and then from Abyssinia to Medina. And each of the Meccan Muslims was paired with somebody from Medina, whether they were Muslim or not, but they were a believer and they were paired. And so when we talk about immigrant settlers of color and the responsibility, this falls into that dynamic, given the way our struggles are intertwined in that way. So this is what is key, that Gaza is originally a part of Rafah, which is the gateway towards North Africa. And the rest of Palestine is the gateway towards what is referred to as the Levant, or Sham. The Levant is actually the Orientalist term, but Sham, right? That includes Syria, that includes Jordan, that includes, in a certain sense, Iraq, that includes Lebanon. All these are contrived states. And of course, Muslims have all grown up, weaned on the project of the Ummah. Oh, we're all one community. And this project has been usurped vis-a-vis even by the Crusaders, by the Zionists, in the manifestation of ISIS. Because this is not a war between Muslims and Jews. This is a war in which Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into by a white supremacist Christianity that imprinted onto Islam in the manifestation of Wahhabism and onto Judaism in the manifestation of Zionism, right? Which are worlds of the above kind of perspectives, Islam of the above kind of perspectives, right? And this becomes crucial because in a formation such as Daesh or ISIS, we saw a lot of 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds Muslims from Britain that have never lived in a predominantly Muslim country go and migrate to Iraq and to Syria in order to live the illusion of the Ummah. But it was an Ummah that was a false dream because it was founded on totalitarian principles. And this is what's key here, right? But the Ummah is supposed to be grounded in spiritual, ethical, political commitments that bind all believers together. Because if you have Arabs and Muslims that are Zionists, indigenous that can be Zionists or Phobic, or this and XYZ hodgepodge identities, anarchists that can be anti-spiritual, that doesn't make them a part of the Ummah. There's an incident of two valiant, courageous youth in Egypt, Ahmed Sharif Abdul Wahab and Muhsin Mustafa. This past July 25th, 2025, they stormed the dungeons of the Egyptian state security headquarters that was in a police station in Egypt, a district in Egypt. And they called themselves the Iron 17 after the chapter in the Quran, the chapter of the Iron, verse number 17. And the verse goes this, that know that Allah revives the earth after its death. We have certainly made the signs clear for you, so perhaps you will understand. Now, these two mujahideen who were inspired by our mujahideen in Gaza said very clearly that they are the grandchildren of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar al-Khattab was he was the second caliph. He was the second caliph leader after the Prophet ﷺ had died, had passed away. And when he died, of course, Omar went around Mecca chanting out, as well as other Muslims, that if you worship Muhammad, then Muhammad is a prophet and a messenger, and he died. But if you worship Allah, then Allah hayyun la yamut, Allah and greater does not die. So who do you worship? And of course, this was part of the original polity, and Omar was a part of it, and then embodied sort of a lot of different characteristics, as did Abu Bakr, the first caliph, as did Uthman, the third caliph, as did Ali, the last caliph, who was the cousin of the Prophet. And they all had different characteristics that complemented one another. Just because somebody was a leader doesn't mean that they were somebody in a position of authoritarian decision making, but rather the entire Ummah conducted itself according to Shura, Ijma', Maslaha. Shura, which means mutual consultation, Ijma', community consensus, Maslaha, what is in the public welfare. And in Islam, we're all khulafa, we're all caretakers, so there's no need for a certain or a single leader in a position of authority. These weren't leaders that traveled with armed guards or lived in palaces. Omar would be found resting underneath the shade of a tree, right? And this is the embodiment of, again, a mujahid Because as a Muslim, we are merely temporary wayfarers, travelers in this earth, resting underneath the shade of the tree until we embark on our next destination. But these two, Ahmed and Muhsin, refer to Omar, them being grandchildren of Omar, who was titled Al Faruq. And Al Faruq means a distinguisher of truth from falsehood. They did not buy into patriotic Egyptian identity. Al Faruq or Omar, of course, was the one that extended Islam and introduced it into North Africa. But they also called themselves as the grandchildren of Amr ibn al-As, who was the famous commander um, in Islam who introduced Islam to Al-Sham, to the Orientalist Levant, Syria, so on. So I say this because they are an embodiment of that ummah, these youth. And they're hardly in their early 20s, even, maybe even younger than that. And they knew what the consequences of their sacrifice would be. And we don't know whether they're murdered. The Egyptian national security and totalitarian state has killed them or murdered them, martyred them, or whether they're being tortured in the dungeons of state security. But that is the unflinching sacrifice that also goes and speaks to what you were asking about before of what do people in the core versus other places need to do. Because as I noted before, that what if a million Egyptians went and marched, as George Abdullah had noted, and I had mentioned this before, even prior to his blessed release, they marched towards the border and broke the barrier of siege. That is what's key here. And we all have to operate according to our local situated geography, as we were talking earlier as well. Will the Egyptian state murder a million of us, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, 10 million? Well, we're 140 million. At least we die standing on our feet as opposed to living on our knees. So where's the will? Where's the power towards this? And this ummah that the Mujahideen in Gaza fight on behalf of, and so part is the world. This is what's key here. And this is what the Mujahideen fight. They're not fighting the Palestinian state. They don't believe in state. They don't believe in the modern conceptualization of the Dawailah that way. And it is an ummah, like I said, that is for all believers, because Palestinians come with all grades. There are Palestinian Jews, there are Palestinian Christians, there are Palestinians are very different. And that is the type of ummah that they're trying to manifest. And what I'm seeing as part of my duty as a student of theirs is to manifest and to act as the translator for their theology, for their praxis, spiritually, ethically, politically, morally. To envision, because I am in a place of privilege where I got the opportunity to study queer and feminist theories, queer indigenous, queer black studies, and queer of color critiques, to establish an extent of their theology towards a queer and a feminist, non-authoritarian and non-capitalist and non-ableist as well. This is what's central in this. This is not a fight over a Palestinian state. That's part of the world of the above logic. And like I said, Gaza broke this order, this international law, this liberal, modern project. And the world is trying to piece itself together. And to band-aid, to substitute a plaster for the cracks, to glue the broken shards of the mirror. And there is no doing it. We have failed Gaza, going back to that original question, because we failed to understand the logics of its operation and what the Mujahideen are actually fighting for, and to engage in the same degree of sacrifice that they are engaging in insofar as their people. So we're projecting our analysis onto them as opposed to working from the inside out. And this is why the political translation, mistranslation is so violent, because we assume a similitude, mimicry between the Arabic concepts, that Muslim concepts are translatable towards English, which is the noun-based narrative or language, excuse me, as opposed to it describing via verbs relationalities. And that means a different cosmology. That means a different way of walking with the land as opposed to on it. And that doesn't imply, again, a lack of relationality with other ideas, Marxism, anarchism, but we need to operate from the inside out as opposed to the outside in and project, because that inherently involves violence. And language is power, it is knowledge. And not everything is translatable. So we need to understand our people on their own terms.
I think this is an issue in it too, because, well, I think about when you're describing this issue between understanding a state and understanding an ummah. I think my own people do it. And we constantly fought to say we are nations. We are nations. We're not tribes, we're nations. Because then if we call ourselves nations, we have more rights within international law. And we gain more respect and are seen as more civilized and all the rest of it. And I think this is one place where we do it to ourselves. And it's something I've been thinking about very recently. What I've thought about much longer and been aware of is where we do this with terms like chief and council. So not just in how one conceives a state, but how one operates it. And so the in settler colonialism, well, Canadians came up with a lot of methods. One the Americans did that the Canadians then emulated instead of the other way was chief and council. And so they called it chief and council, and they told us that our words translated into chief and council. And so then we accept this, and we're forced to run chief and council in the specific system that's hierarchical and includes voting and in what looks like their version of democracy. And it pisses me off when they're like, oh, we use the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy is nothing like Canadian and American democracy. They are not the same thing. That is also a mistranslation. And it's a really dangerous one. But also this idea of chief and council. It was designed so that we would through hierarchy accept capitalism, and it worked, and sell off pieces of breads. And so that worked. But our chiefs weren't chiefs. Chief is the wrong word. Orator is probably a correct word. Somebody who's well knowledge in something, and amongst my own people, if 6 people in your community excelled in a certain field, all of them were chief of that field. And so it wasn't something you were voted to be the leader of. Like even war chiefs, we had multiple war chiefs at one time discussing their opinions. There wasn't one above the other. And so I think these are all the ways we've also mistranslated to create a state where there wasn't a state.
And this is the faltering of the third world banding non-aligned movements. Because they assumed in the overthrowing of the colonizers that they could use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, that the state could be an instrument of liberation as opposed to its being a hard and packaged deal with capitalism, because although they may share short-term animosities, their long-term strategic interests are one and the same. And both are colonial products of modernity. And Nasser, for instance, the pan-Arab socialists, he attempted this in the unity with Syria, and it failed, despite the distance geography that acted as a hindrance. He also tried to have the idea of a smaller Africa, because in his mind, if you actually draw a line around Egypt, Sudan, Libya, they'll form the image of a smaller Africa. And to him, Egypt was composed the labor, Libya composed the resources, Sudan the land, right? And by fusing these together, that they would be able to establish a more resolute project. But they failed to consider the limitation of the nation state itself as a structure. And hence the pan-Africanist and pan-Arab model will always do this fail, because we did not go to our own notions of sovereignty governance. And in fact, we fail to recognize how, again, all states are fascistic. All states crystallize power in hierarchical forms, such to limit dissent, to limit argument, and to limit contestation. Meanwhile, in the Ummah, power is fluid and it was dynamic. That just because you had a center or a node in Baghdad didn't mean you had Iraq, and Damascus didn't mean that you had a Syria. And these decentralized nodes of power, you can contest and you can challenge these nodes of power as being a part of a confederacy in which power is not concrete and hegemonic, because these landscapes were open. There were no boundaries, there were no borders, there was no citizenship, there was no passports, there was fluid mobility, dynamics, movements, and so on and so forth. Hence is the difference and the failure of people understanding what the nation state is in retrospect to alternative forms of sovereignty. And because all states are fascist, even this rich, again, we go back to the question of narrative. Oh, Trump has heightened fascism. No, the system is inherently fascistic because of daddy, because of mommy. What Trump wants to be is totalitarian and to mimic Xi, Kim Jong-un, and Putin. Totalitarianism is different than fascism, which is it's an emboldened form of fascism in which there is, just as at the place of Hitler, the ability to contest vis-a-vis courts, ice raids, or doxing becomes even far more limited because the Supreme Court, because judicial, federal, local, etc., have less sway and have less power in contesting what the administration has and wills, does, right? So this is the vision, the project that MAGA is out to revive. Trump has merely taken the mask off what America always has been and always will continue to be. So the failure of understanding the difference between totalitarianism and fascism, of the necessity to keep power fluid as opposed to its static nature in the question or as it relates to the nation state. One can contest, and there are many incidences and there are many narrations of people arguing with General Sinwar, who is not a totalitarian, who is not somebody that, landed the gauntlet or laid down the gauntlet and then everybody was simply to follow orders. On the contrary, they were an embodiment. Him, as with the companions of the Prophet, were an embodiment in a revolutionary way of Islamic characteristics of even in terms of their character. Like when one looks, like at the original companions of the Prophet, like I mentioned Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was known as a Siddiq, and he was soft and gentle hearted and honest. Omar was more, if you will, jealous over Islam. So he was more prone to anger when he saw injustice, right? Because he came to Islam late and he used to commit femicide, he used to kill his own daughters. He would laugh when he would eat on a hungry day. He ate a god made of dates, and he would be reminded of this. But his character and his demeanor was different. Uthman كان سخي. He came from a very wealthy family, but he expended all his resources and his wealth towards the Ummah. Ali was known, he was the cousin of the Prophet, and he was known as the door to knowledge and married to the Prophet's daughter. So look at how they complemented each other, even in terms of character, in terms of demeanor, because people have different characteristics and demeanor. And together, they formulate all facets of what an ideal warrior would be like. Because we can't be everything to everyone all the time. But in coming together and embodying that characteristic, this is why the Zapatistas teach. Holding each other's hand, we ask one another what each of us knows. Skill sharing, but also in demeanor. And this is how we discover the revolutionary horizon together. Because we all have our blind spots. And again, we all have different things that make us sweet to people and make us slightly sour to people, unpalatable to people. Right? And character, that is part of it. It's not just that, oh, well, you and I share spiritual, ethical, political commitments. Some people are like fire, others are like water and have healing properties. So fire has healing properties, but in a different way, right? In terms of, cleansing wounds and so on and so forth. But this is the complementarity. The tears have to be there, but so does the unflinching militancy.
Yeah.
And this is what's key, and people forget that, right? And this is what leads to authoritarianism. So it is a different mode of social relations. And this is why our mujahideen, like Mohamed al-Dayf, was very sweet. He spent a lot of time with the mujahideen. Like I said, he liked to tell jokes. He behaved with them as their older brother. The general was more of like an aura kind of figure. The general was the kind of figure that if you had a meeting with him and it ended at 12 o'clock sharp on the dot, he'd be like, you're done. You're going to eat somebody else's time. He was very quiet. He was to himself when, it was time for prayer. He'd leave whatever important gathering and he'd go attend the prayer. So He was more in his head and his mind because the weight and his position of responsibility was different than Aldair. It didn't make him better. It didn't make him worse, but he was just of a different demeanor. This is
Mhm.
why Abu Ubaidah is a symbol. We were talking about the Zapatistas hiding our faces. Abu Ubaidah is a symbol. 1,000 other Ubaidas wait to take up the position and the mantle if Abu Ubaidah has been martyred, and we still don't know that because our Mujahideen have not said. But this is the humility of being selfless because we plant seeds, and this is what our Mujahideen, not knowing if we're going to have the opportunity to see what they're going to fruit towards or to become. But this is part of the letting go. I don't need to be acknowledged for what I do. I don't need somebody to even know my name. The left spends a lot of time between, after, and before elections, right? And they think that, again, socialism could be built on the fodder of settler colonial state you can't have. You know, a proletarian state against a bourgeois state, on all these false binaries that replicate the hegemony as opposed to actually constructing a counter-hegemonic force. But the
And
only
I
way that you can conceive of that is by different social relations that are political.
and I think Mexico is a good example of it. And how completely it would be an erasure, because the Mexican Revolution decided we're going to culturally erase indigenous people. And it was really effective. They did it very differently than the US and Canada, or though they did and they didn't. It was like just how like every settler is either a Métis or a Cherokee princess. Mexico's all right. We're all kind of somewhat indigenous. They're gone. And yet Mexico is still a settler state. They are still very oppressive to indigenous people, which is why uh, the Zapatistas rose up in Chiapas uh, because they're settlers. Anyway.
And this is why the Zapatistas gave a middle finger to Obrador and his student, Claudia, who's merely a populist Calvinist who whitewashes indigenous struggles by parading indigenous people here and there, who's interested and does hire, who's interested in development projects like across the Lacundana jungle, who's hired paramilitaries to annihilate the Zapatistas and hence their entire restructuring and reordering, particularly over this past couple of years, and so on and so forth, right? With a feminist gaze, with a feminist twist, if you will.
Yeah.
This is the sad reality. People fall for that. The fact that a change of operator does not alter the structure. Mexico is a settler state, right? Just as much as any other. And the way that CISOs look down on indigenous people is a perfect embodiment, right? That you're savages, you're privileged, you're primitive because you're cast to the rurality. Despite the fact that when you enter Oventique, the first sign that you see is La Realidad. This is actually the reality. Whatever you came from is actually a facade, it's a mirage. It's just smoke and mirror. But you want to really see what humanity is, how we live, how we act, how we embody, and the manifestation of that differently in different local communities to deal with things like theft or sexism or misogyny. That becomes part of the experimentation project altogether. And the idea of self-critique that the Zapatistas hold of high esteem and high values. Leftists don't like to engage in self-critique. That is the degree of egomaniacal arrogance that exists. But look at a revolutionary movement, one of the most renowned and foremost of the 21st century, and they all know it, but they don't want to engage it, or they don't want to, again, learn from it any more than they want to learn from our mujahideen. So
Trump threatening the sovereignty of other settler states has the annoying effect of them becoming more nationalistic. And as an Indigenous person, all the Save Canada crap is pissing me off. I see this as a time to weaken the settler state further. Would you agree? Should people be taking advantage of the weakness of the nation states they live in and the ones immediately around the US, such as Canada and Mexico, both who are settler colonies with the same indigenous population as the US?
Absolutely, because you have, an arbitrary border devised by colonialism that separates so-called Canada from so-called the United States. And of course, the US constructs its history from 1619. Canada calls it a cultural genocide, although it may start at 1492. And the Truth and Reconciliation, empty rhetoric, right? From Trudeau, the elder, the father, as you noted, the white papers to, Mr. Justin Trudeau, the racist, blackface, Trudeau.
And on that note, let's point out that it was another brown skin in a white mask, an indigenous person who became a judge and a senator. How like colonized can you get? Who invented the term cultural genocide so that settlers wouldn't have to be told they committed genocide. It
Well, it's
just
the acquiescence and the sense of false safety, of false belonging. And not all forms of nationhoods are statist, as Ashanti, as our indigenous siblings, as exist within Islam. And that bears a certain distinction. The problem that we're talking about is patriotism and ethno-nationalism, really, in that respect. It's sort of the Somalis in Minnesota. Oh, look, manifest destiny. Oh,
yeah.
look, New York is 10 with Mandani that we spoke about earlier. The idea is to engage, like we were talking earlier, in an insurgency that abandons those terms and begins to construct a manifestation of an ummah in the lands upon which it is located. But to break through, I mean, you have the US-Canada border cuts through Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee territory. Same land, same people. So the ability to build those nodes and across, right? And to recognize the limitations of no Dakota insofar as the illusion of nonviolence, the willingness to get arrested, all this, all these outright lies that require far more of a degree of sacrifice.
I want to interrupt here. And they're the lies that get upheld because that's what gets upheld over indigenous actions that refuse all those things. So carry
The
on.
same
Sorry.
way that relabeling a street in Washington, D.C. that's now been erased, Black Lives Matter, that was painted during the Black Spring, or renaming Confederate bases, that have been renamed again after white supremacists and so on and so forth. This is the empty facade of rhetoric. We're taking down statues. I'm not opposed to any of these, but why aren't we attacking the military bases instead of actually focusing on the fact that they're named after Confederate generals? They should be destroyed. And any black or brown person that is part of that conscription is an enemy.
Yeah.
And anybody who has skills, who is part of the military, and all of a sudden is an anti-war vet who is on a flotilla to go save Gaza, are you willing? Somebody like Gregory Stoker, again, I don't know him personally. Are you willing to go against the American entity? Are you willing to share your skills that you use to murder and kill Muslims and Afghanis, my own people? Are you willing to share those skills with Indigenous and Black siblings? Are you willing to defend them? You don't get to simply lay down your weapon because all of a sudden you're an anti-war vet.
Yeah. You don't
Khalid
get to
ibn
murder
al-Walid,
people and then be a pacifist.
Khalid ibn al-Walid, for instance, and the lies that we tell ourselves that the flotillas broke the siege. What siege that was broken? This is part of the hypocrisy. Unless we construct a victory very different, because you never broke the siege. All the resources, all the millions of dollars to get those boats out there, all the resources that were tossed in the water were handed over to the Zionist entity. And then the outright lies of coming and saying, well, we allowed peasant fishermen an opportunity to fish. And it turns out those videos were from January of last year.
Mhm.
So when we know that the foregone conclusion is arrest, what is the point then? What is the point? Because you're never going to break the siege and you're never going to reach the shore and you're never going to bring the humanitarian aid. Why are we reverting to international law when the jig is up? But we still are reverting to defend our right for anti-colonial resistance. Why do we need to refer to those discourses or even human rights? But this is the irony. So we keep on replicating again these dynamics, these falsehoods that should have been broken on October 7th. I was going to say something else, but I think the speed of the ideas got the better of me in that respect. So
Okay. I want to take apart an idea then.
yeah,
Because I, for a long time, would say that I can be both anarchistic and want a Lakota state and an Anishinaabe state, a Cree state, or nation. But as I've been thinking about it and, our weaker impulses, and I've been thinking about words, which goes back to mistranslation. And this is why I'm like, we weren't nations. We were tribes. We didn't conceive of ourselves as nations. We conceived of ourselves as people and allies and friends and being of the land. That's most of what our nation names mean. And I don't know. Is there also etymology in names that would suggest, also what you're looking for is more of communities and umas and not nations and states? Like, are we wrong in thinking like there is like a non-problematic nationhood, or is that just a word we've started to use that maybe doesn't fit how we actually described ourselves?
Yes, the closest would be like that nation, and I'm mostly drawing on Elder Ashanti Alston in that form of like Black nationhood that is again not built or constructed around sort of
And this is where
Afropanist or racial or racialist sort of identity, right? But to recognize that there's something that, and this is where we go back to 1492 and the importance of the element of religion or spirituality, because we all know race is a construct. We all suffer as a consequence of it. But it's like James Baldwin had noted, if you have to call me by the N-word, that's because you, the white man, that was your only point of reference to me. That's your problem. That's not mine. But we've taken that up as sort of the premise primordially that will alleviate us, that will liberate us. So we've taken up also race as the white man's prison as an instrument of resistance, limited though that may be. And this is where religion or spirituality has to come into play, because like we said earlier, if we're not feeding into identity reductionism, then it isn't an issue about whether you're indigenous or you're black or this and that in the context of that myopic understanding nation, right? Like all I know is that for me, the term for that from an Islamic perspective would be the ummah, because that means that not all Muslims are within the ummah, not all indigenous, not all black. It's not contingent upon those. It's the shared ethical, political commitments and responsibilities that we are beholden to one another to, and that we commit to, and that we fulfill to the best of our abilities or capacities. So that's what's key here. And that way we're able again to transcend the idea that a nation can be simply based on a reductionist understanding of identity. Because we all need to rediscover indigeneity. We all believe and we all have the element of the fitra. We all need to, we're not going back to 1492. Pure Palu strife has been introduced to this content, quote unquote, invasive species. So we need to all relearn the land. We all need to walk it again, including indigenous people, including immigrant settlers of color. Everybody has to do that simultaneously. It doesn't left for one group to lead or one group to simply be the decision maker at the expense of everybody else, while understanding that we have different villages and complicities. Because yes, and like I said before, an Afghani or Palestinian displaced as a refugee because of consequence of imperialism, etc., war, mar, becoming a settler of color on Turtle Island doesn't mean they say enjoy the same privileges as a white man, but that doesn't mean that they're not complicit in indigenous dispossession and the undermining of Black self-determination, right? So this is where Black and indigenous struggles are very much aligned, as we talked before, because white settler colonialism increased all our lives. You have indigenous people, as we said before, that were conscripted towards, in certain cases, Black enslavement. We have Black people that were conscripted towards indigenous genocide. This is where Afro-Indigenous futurities does allow a transcendence of identity politics, because we won't have indigenous sovereignty without Black self-determination. We won't have Black self-determination without indigenous sovereignty. This is what was missing out of North Dakota. What was missing out of the Black Spring is this is the settler colony. So you're not going to have Black Lives Mattering without indigenous sovereignty, and let alone the element of Africa, because that was dismissed as well. The international scope, Africa, the size of you know, China, East and West Europe, the US and Canada. That's how big. So what, Black Lives Matter don't matter there? What about Africa? And the question of imperialism. And then we have the question of black on black ethnocentrism, because you have black immigrants that migrate from Africa for all kinds of reasons. And it's not just that they may vote Republican, but the way that they look at African Americans, well, you all are lazy and you're musicians or you're artists or you engage in sports, but get over yourselves in slavery without understanding the exceptional nature and the singularity of anti-blackness in the US or in Canada, right? And vice versa. Black people or African Americans can and do a bit of times look at Africans as, well, you're here to grab our jobs, or you don't understand the nature of what we've suffered. So this is part of the ongoing reproduction of these complicities and these privileges between all of us. So the one
And
thing to straighten it, yeah,
we put them into so many categories that
yeah,
we don't even know. We exclude others. Like we almost will talk about Black enslavement and some indigenous nations on the East Coast being involved in the slave trade, but there are much larger populations of indigenous people who were enslaved in California and Canada. Canada had slavery, but until the War of 1812, the majority of slaves in Canada were indigenous. Black slaves
absolutely. And that's a major distinction. Yeah,
Black slaves they did exist, but they had different roles.
absolutely. Agreed. Agreed. Historically, that's a fact. Absolutely. And a lot of people forget that the context of Canada was animated by both genocide, but also the enslavement of indigenous people, which happened in the US too, but
And in
the plantations,
California.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Can you speak more to why the axis of resistance is not a unified front? And in that, what the different fronts are and their primary goals?
Thank you. The different fronts are the axis of resistance as it is understood are Al-Qassam and other factions of the Mujahideen, like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the context of Gaza. Of course, there are dimensions of that in Al-Daffa, in the West Bank, and so on. But also Ansarullah in Yemen, as well as Syria under Bashar al-Assad. At least that's what typically is taken as the axis of resistance. The butcher of Damascus, Bashar al-Assad, yani. And then you have, of course, Iran, and yeah, of course, you have other factions like Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi that exists, Hezbollah groups, etc., that exist in Iraq as well. But generally, the main players are Yemen, Ansarullah, the Mujahideen in Gaza. Like I said, you have the context of Syria, which is not so much anymore, as well as the context of Iran. Now, these are the different players, at least traditionally within what is referred to as the axis of resistance. The primary goal of each, sadly, they are not bound by a project of the Ummah that we are talking about. And so Ansarullah in Yemen is not fighting for a Yemeni state, so perhaps it is closest to an Islam of the below that is embodied, at least from a rhetorical perspective, to the Mujahideen in Gaza, because they're also fighting for an Ummah. Syrians and the rest, I would argue, are vying for their own local interests. So they will support the Mujahideen so long as it does not conflict with their local nationalist interests. So, of course, sorry, I missed also Hezbollah in Lebanon. Forgive me, I don't know how I forgot. Hezbollah is invested, and this is now the difference in terms of beginning to talk about the non-unified. One can support Iran fighting the Crusaders and the Zionists and supporting them and being very gleeful and being happy about the destruction of Tel Aviv by Iranian missiles. And of course, Iran there's no doubt about that the Mujahideen in Gaza have spoken very unflinchingly the fact that they have received support from the Revolutionary Guards, from Iran, and otherwise. No doubt about that. But things are far more complicated because to present the axis as a unified front, that's a lot. we stand against imperialist intervention in Iran, but Iran is also invested in being a part of the League of Nations. Iran is not the same revolutionary project or zeal as it was when it started in 79 under Ayatollah Khomeini. It has crystallized as a state. The more any revolutionary project, if it's not pushing its own bounds, it becomes delimited in its revolutionary horizon and potential. And yes, Iran is under siege. Yes, it has created a lot of innovations. There's no doubt about that. But Iran has to choose between its loyalties to the above and the world of the above, because you can't worship two masters, the above and the below. You can't pledge your allegiance to an Iranian state, an Egyptian state, a Lebanese state. Hezbollah started an anti-colonialist movement, providing services and resources and so on. And that ebbed and flowed. But now it has become increasingly invested in Lebanese unity, in Lebanese sovereignty, and hence its loyalties to the above. It has to make a choice. And this is the difference between Hassan Nasrallah's approach, may Allah accept his martyrdom, and General Sinwar. General Sinwar had the foresight that the movement was going to be of the below. And I believe things are what they are, that if Samahat Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah was still alive, the situation would be very different. Because he didn't believe that the Zionist entity wanted a full-fledged war, which is the biggest mistake that he committed, especially after the pager bombings. And they have to make a choice. The correct choice, God knows best, should have been everybody should have went in on October 7th. Everybody. Because that was the moment of peak of surprise. And yes, the devastation would have been cataclysmic. But you know what? That is going to happen anyways. I mean, how many were martyred in Algeria? Millions, not just 1 million. The land of a million martyrs. More than that, actually. Right? And yet Algeria is not free. Everybody is playing through the game of the above. So Hezbollah has a choice. Tens of thousands of incursions. And the breaking Israel Zionist entity, the American entity, really has no understanding of a ceasefire because these are not people of honor.
Yeah.
Right? And every single time, the only language that they understand is the language of force. And you keep on allowing them to engage in assassinations. And Hezbollah is deeply infiltrated, not at the level of just drone, the surveillance, but from within. I mean, the larger that you are, the more invested in the state that you are, the more likely you are to have infiltrators and potentials for counterinsurgency and COINTELPRO and so on. Now imagine Iran. Yes, it recovered from the original hit during the 12-week war within 24 or 48 hours. But the game is not over. It's still heavily infiltrated. And Iran is a big nation, multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious. That makes it more vulnerable and more susceptible. This is the key. Yemen, it could have done more. Ansarullah could have done more. They could have closed Bab al-Mandab. So we have to be able to all share more than what we can spare. Yemen has done a lot, but it's also geographically distant and its abilities and resources. And yes, it's been supported by Iran. And of course, Yemen has had its own contributions and innovations even beyond Iran, because often Arabian Peninsula Arabs from the Gulf will say, oh, look, without Iran, you're all just militias of Iran. You wouldn't be able to do something, which is not true. Look at what the Mujahideen did on their own. Look at what Ansarullah does on its own. So that's not exactly true either. They're not just tentacles of Iran, as the Zionist crusading entity would like us to think. But there are choices. You cannot preserve Lebanese sovereignty and at the same time engage in full-fledged anti-colonial resistance. And Naim Qassem, with all due respect, is not the brilliant orator that Nasrallah was. There's a reason that strategic hawks were taken out immediately, like Nasrallah and like others. This is what's key to understand, because they are more hawkish and unflinching in their approach and more militant in their approach that way. Naim, not so much, because again, of course, and I can understand his position, that you don't want Lebanon and Beirut destroyed, but what choice is there? Just open all the fronts and let's get going. Because again, it's like we're all living this Kafkaesque sort of like the trial, this endless postponement of judgment. to something that we know is going to happen anyways, which is utmost devastation and destruction. But at least, or again, for new grass to grow, some of the old must die. At least we would offer ourselves an opportunity, and we have the element of surprise. But we cannot keep stalling here. Iran, if it could come with a nuclear deal, if it could remove the sanctions, if it could get away with not having to deal with the negotiations or the desire for negotiations over its ballistic weapons, which will never happen. Iran will never allow it, rightfully so. If it could get away with all of that, though, it would. But people have to make choices. Movements and people in positions of power have to make those choices. So Iran has to choose. Is it the Ummah or is it the Iranian state? Lebanon has to choose. Is it Lebanon and Lebanese sovereignty and a taghut, a master world of the above, or is it the below and Allah and the Ummah? That's the difference. I said, just to address this point, it makes no difference being a purported butcher of Damascus, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, I don't know what. And this is part of the legacy of the Arab Spring, the false choices that we were dealt with, either despotic dictators or Islams of the above, or somebody like Ashara, former ISIS, former Al-Qaeda, who has just been given a whitewashed image, who's now embraced by Euro-America, who's allowed incursions into Syria, whose army has been destroyed, whose land has been destroyed and looted, and so on and so forth. And again, each of these concepts or contexts we could speak for hours. Okay. But I'm trying to address the major principle. This is why a change in operator does nothing. The problem with Syria is the logic of the state. The problem with any of these fronts is the problem of the state that does not be contended with. And until Muslims and predominantly Muslim nations address this question of alternative forms of sovereignty, nothing is going to change. This is why even in end-time prophecies, and the last piece that I wrote, that when Jesus, at least according to Muslim prophecy, and when Mahdi, who is a descendant of the family of the Prophet, who will not covet power, will return, are they going to seize a state to achieve Palestine's liberation? No, they won't. They establish a movement of the below. They will be a part of the arc of the below. They will fulfill the prophecies of Gaza and Asqalan, a prophecy in which the Prophet noted the most honorable mujahideen and members of the Ummah will appear in Gaza. And Asqalan, that Gaza is a part of, and that has historical significance since the second Caliph of Omar, the Caliphate of Omar. So this is the problem. They're not a common front. They have different local interests, and their different investments mean, therefore, that the access is not on one page. So yeah, I hope that changes. Yeah, because the fate not only of the region or of the territory, but also the world, in so many ways, rests upon it. And that is not to say that, well, it's not all on us in the region, the responsibilities that so-called Egyptians have, Egyptians that engage in Arab supremacy and anti-blackness and blah, 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 given the anti-Nubian sentiment, the anti-Sudanese. I mean, look at the mess that we're all in, right? And responsibilities that exist for people in the core, right? But let's stop lying to ourselves. Let's get more critical than we actually are at this point. So people in power. So yeah. So yeah, if there are positive lessons, is that we need to engage in self-critique. Sorry?
Let me ask it then.
Oh,
Okay.
sure.
What lessons, positive and negative, can the future of resistance learn from the reality of non-unified fronts? And I guess that means both in how can we come together to be a strong unified front, and what are the problems when we're not that we keep failing to address?
Being self-critical. I'm tired of folks talking about a multipolar world that's based on a false choice between a Zionist crusading Wahhabi alliance and a totalitarian Russian-Chinese axis on the other hand. I'm tired of people, in the name of anti-imperialism, we can be against interventionism, but unless we have a robust critique of the nation state that does not belong in our discourse or in our lexicon and is not part of our ways of living. As people of color, it's very insulting and indignant because it basically says that without what Europe had given us, the construct of the nation state, we don't have an alternative forms of governance that exists historically, materially, spiritually in our histories. We do. And so to those who say, well, you're being romantic and you're engaging in a Puritan kind of politics and idealistic kind of politics, then what is the Zapatistas? What are the 18 days of Tahrir? What are the Naxalites in India? What about the Mujahideen in Gaza? Because they broke the molds. They said they're not interested in mediocrity. They're not interested in preserving the Yemeni state. So in the name of anti-imperialism, we're going to justify a butcher of Damascus. In the name of freeing Syria, we're going to justify al-Golani and the Zionist incursions. In the name of anti-imperialism, we're not going to allow ourselves to be critical with regards to how different movements have chosen different loyalties to the state versus to the below. That's unjust. And that's disrespectful to Islam, and that's disrespectful to the Mujahideen and the arc and trajectory that they are on. We all have to give something up, and there is no easy choice. And this is what that requires, the 1492 analysis, and again, an understanding of settler colonialism and the role and settler states that exist all over the world, and the role that states are a problem. Every single state is a problem. It has blunted any kind of revolutionary potential, any understanding of direct democracy outside the parameters of statehood. Is that hard work? Yes, it's hard work, because that means we have to sit down and be with one another in circles, and debates will take days and hours, and we may not even reach a consensus. But that is the way that things operate. And I find that most of the people that make that argument are people who actually have not gotten themselves dirty in terms of the level of organizing that is necessary. There are people who are operating in theoretical world or part of the new generation of youth that gravitates towards Marxist-Leninism. The past 2 years have been life transforming, understandably. Their first experience is with a genocide in Gaza. They don't have no background in terms of organizing or theoretical perspectives, and they tend to not engage with a lot of political philosophy either. They don't have a good understanding of theories of power. They don't have a good understanding of social movements over the past 20 years. They're like, oh, the entire Arab Spring was a Euro-American conspiracy. Excuse me? Well, that's an insult to the over 1,000 martyrs that happened in the context of Egypt.
Also, white people do this all the time. Anytime brown and black people stand up, fight back, make some poor white person cry, it's like, oh, they didn't really do that. It was a conspiracy. No, people fight back.
Well,
Don't take that away.
That's part of the indignant myth that, oh, the Zionist entity allowed October 7th to happen, just as much as AIPAC is in control of America. But it's also Arabs and Muslims and brown people that look with the Arab Spring, for instance. No, Tunis and Egypt were genuine uprisings, and so was the one in Syria. It's just that Syria, and they all happened simultaneously, did not learn from the faults of Egypt, and Egypt did not learn from the faults of Tunis, and everybody was replicating this liberal democracy. We want human rights. We want a state for everyone. You know, we want the Western image of liberal politics, the veneer, the facade. That's what happened. And so Syria ended up, just as much as Libya, going down the rabbit hole of a proxy war. And what would happen? And Egypt would have went down that same hole too. That's the problem. But that doesn't take away from the genuine uprising in Egypt, particularly in the early period of the Arab Spring. I'm sorry, we went out. Yes. And no, we're not Zionist or American stooges. And no, we're not all the same. And some of us had a very critical take with regards to this thing called the Egyptian state, which is a modern construct that Egyptians perceive existed, whose boundaries and borders Egyptians perceive existed since time immemorial for over 7,000 years. Well, we're all descendants of Pharaoh. oh, let's erase Nubians and Sudanese and Siwabi and Bedouin people and indigenous people and so on and so forth. The construct, people fail to understand what nation states are, how they came to be, what their purpose is, how they remold and reshape themselves in their own image because they have to recreate new images of masculinity and femininity in times of upheaval, new constructions of its own racial and ethnic identity in times of upheaval, just as much as white nationalism is trying to purge itself.
Right now, and this is why Nick Fuentes says Trump doesn't really stand for MAGA anymore.
So it's a desire to recreate who the white man is, who the loyal American citizen is, who the loyal Egyptian, Syrian, whatever citizen is. Otherwise, you're an outcast because you're this or that. Because critique is forbidden. Thought is forbidden. So, people really need to put things into perspective. This is about structures. The hell with Assad and the hell with Ashar. Other societies, other nations, other movements need to make a choice. Gaza made its choice. Gaza needs to be the compass, the unflinching arrow that teaches everybody about what needs to be done. Discursively, in terms of thought, in terms of models of sovereignty, in terms of everything. So that's what taking the lead means. That's what learning the lessons and becoming a student of the Mujahideen is. Not trying to, again, have your piece and eat it too. Gaza is fighting on top of the world or for a different world, for a different ummah. But where is everybody else? That becomes the question. And what are they sacrificing and the extent to which they are sacrificed? Not 10%, not 50%, 100%, 1,000%. Gaza has paid its dues so many times over for the rest of the world, and everybody has to learn. That's part of the humility too. So let's stop lying to ourselves, just as much as lying to ourselves about the flotilla, lying to ourselves about the action, lying. This is where we are. We're not, oh, Russia and China care for us. No, they don't. So yeah, Russia, it abandoned Syria. Could care less. Now you're discovering that China is not on board. What were the totalitarian weapons, surveillance equipment that's selling to Arab dictatorship? Again, its role in Myanmar, and so on and so forth. What do you think that this is? Do you think China wants a non-statist world, a borderless world, a free world, an abolitionist world, a decolonial world? Not about Chinese government here, just so that people don't think I'm talking about Chinese people.
China's been pro-empire for a pretty long time.
Well, the cobalt mining 60,000 African kids. Right? Canada, of course. Again, it's why are the moment that you begin to critique, they're like, oh well, then you're again an American citizen. Just like we spent like 4 hours now critiquing America. I'm just pointing to something that's also problematic. What the mining corporations, insofar as Africa, that's not a problem, right? Come on. Xi parading in his hyper-masculinist military to outstage Trump with Kim Jong-un and with the nuclear weapons, with the newest ballistic weapons, with this and that. That's not supposed to be a problem. All that in the name of anti-imperialism. It's just like they're just vying to be the new masters of the new world order.
Yeah, I don't
want degrees of capitalism here. One state capitalism, the other one full-fledged oligarchy in the context of Russia. What are we talking about
here? And the irony is, like, we've actually all seen that. Yeah, I don't want to be decolonized by, selling myself to China or Russia. I don't want them to be my next colonizers. I don't want any colonizers. That made me lose my point. I'm sorry. We have seen this before as a solution. You brought up the Bandung conference and that decolonization, but there was discussions in that time about not choosing either the capitalist or communist model. There were people who were like, we shouldn't choose either. And they were told, well, you have to choose one or the other because you have to choose a statist model. And which then put you under, one form or the other, one master or the other, one empire or another. So we have seen this option before, right?
The Cold War wasn't so cold for the global South, was it? There was a theater
Yeah.
of war for us. And this is why I'm see if we could talk about language and words. Global South and Global North. Global South and Global North are not geographies. Global South condition. Global South is a condition that exists in the Banlieue, in France. It exists on indigenous reserves, in gentrified neighborhoods. What are we talking about here? It's not a geography. Oh, the global South versus the global North. What about the fragments of fragments of fragments of people? People of color, people who are poor, people who are houseless, people who are disabled. What are we talking about here? Again, we're assuming that the same mode of analysis from the 50s and 60s and 70s and theorizations. Our ancestors bequeathed us knowledge and histories and sacrificed themselves, and they are martyrs. And the only way to honor them is to build on what they created and critique and the lessons that we learn, not to try and mimic. We're far from what our ancestors were in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Where are the Panthers? Where's all that? Where's the transnationalism? We're living a fantasy. So self-critique. This is why I go back to this. And it will be the small, it will be the few that will alter the course. As the Mujahideen teaches, the Zapatistas have shown, as the Panthers have shown, it's not the large mass movements that reproduce the hegemony of hegemony, authoritarianism. The masses is an abstract concept just as much as labor, just as much as, the poor and so on and so forth. The poor are my race. The queer, trans, poor woman, worker, again, 2 to 3 jobs, 2 to 3 kids. Her positionality, their positionality is very different than somebody who's white, somebody who's racist, somebody who's whatever. If that is not taken as a mode of analysis, so yeah, this totalitarian project, I ain't interested in. Yeah, I care for the poor, but not on those terms. The terms of the analysis, of the analytics needs to shift. So yeah, and that means a revision, a deep-seated revision that is non-ideological. That's what's key.
So let's transition from the fact that what we need is self-critique, which is really missing in our societies as a whole. As a whole, I run into this inability to self-critique all the time in my line of work. So the inability to take a self-critique and how that plays out into betrayals. And we have a whole question on this, but when we go through it, let's keep that aspect of it in mind, how our lack of self-critique leads to betrayals within communities and movements. And on the ground in the core in terms of encampments and doxing and betrayals there. Let's make that the question rather than what I wrote earlier.
Let's pick that up, inshallah, next Saturday.
Okay, so we will come back with more videos, and that will be some of what we're going to discuss. And we will be here on a tarot channel because YouTube apparently is trying to silence and not promote politics. So this is the place to get your politics, folks. And we will be back.
Thank you so much, Krista. Thank you all for listening. I'm deeply humbled and honored. And I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity, and I hope folks find the exchange, the knowledge sharing useful, and that they take it in with a blessed heart and soul, and for us all to engage in that project of some reflexivity and critique simultaneously at the same time. Thank you again.
Thank you, Wopia. I am so blessed that you are here and we get to do this over here. And for people watching, you can put things in the comments that you'd also like us to talk about over time. I leave my comments on. And if you want to ask a question that is likely to get removed by YouTube, ask it more carefully. Talk to you all later, folks, and we will be back.